Okay, guys, Professor Hildebrandt here. This will be the second lecture for Chapter 5, so Chapter 5, Part B. This is our first truly macroeconomics chapter, and so if you haven't caught the first video yet, go back. I introduced a few different definitions and concepts that we'll use throughout the rest of the course, and then talk about our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. In the second half of Chapter 5, we're basically going to do a history overview of our macroeconomy here in the United States. Some of this will be covered in more detail later, but just going ahead and giving you a brief overview of kind of the changes that we've seen. So before and during the Great Depression, our economy was very up and down, drastically up and down, okay? So it was, I like to say boom or bust. There wasn't a lot of even ground. We were either doing really, really well or we were really, really suffering. Then the Great Depression happened, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. After the Great Depression to the early 70s, we call it the Age of Keynes, or demand-side economics, so we'll talk more about that famous economist as well. Then we had a period of what's called stagflation that lasted for about a decade, and then we kind of had these normal times, nothing too severe. We had a lot of growth in the 90s, so that was nice. Brief recession in 2001, but not too bad. And then we had the Great Recession that started in December of 2007 and went into 2009. And so that's basically what I'm going to cover in this brief lecture. So while I'm not too hung up on dates, I do think it's important that you know when the Great Depression happened. So the Great Depression was a 4-year span from 1929 to 1933. It was the deepest economic contraction that our U.S. economy had ever experienced, and we have not experienced anything like it since then. Our stock market completely crashed. Investment spending by firms dropped to basically nothing because they were so uncertain about what would happen. A lot of people lost their jobs, so consumer spending fell also. We saw bank failures. So prior to the Great Depression, there was no insurance. There was no federally insured deposits with banks. And so the way banking works, though, just a basic little example here, you give the bank your money to hold on to. They don't just hold on to it. Banks make their profit by taking your money, lending it out to someone else, and charging that person interest. That's how banks make money. So what happened was people started panicking, and everyone went to the banks at the same time demanding their money. Well, the banks didn't have enough cash. And so this created more panics, and the more that people panicked, the more our banking system truly failed. Overall, we saw the money supply in our economy drop by a third. And students always like to ask, well, what caused the Great Depression, right? Well, there was a lot of different factors that probably played into the severe economic contraction that we had over those 4 years. But one thing that we saw leading up to the Great Depression was this worldwide escalation in restricting trade. So countries were throwing tariffs on each other left and right. You put a tariff on my goods, so I'm going to put a tariff on your goods, and it really choked out world trade. And so that definitely was a contributing factor to the economic hardships that we had. I mentioned this in the first video for Chapter 5, but what we saw over the 4-year span of the Great Depression was a leftward shift, right? We're going in toward the origin, showing a decrease in aggregate demand from 1929 to 1933. What did this then mean? Well, it means that our price level dropped and our total production dropped as well. So again, we saw this big decline in aggregate demand. Real GDP, or output, dropped by about 26%. Our price level also dropped by 26%, and we saw an unemployment rate in our country of around 25%. And you really have to get in the mindset of that period of time to understand the significance of this 25% unemployment rate. So 25%, 1 in 4, right? Okay. Well, modern day, here we are, 2021. When I say 1 in 4 people don't have a job, you think of a household, you usually think of 2 adults who both work. That was not the case during the Great Depression. 1 in 4 people without a job meant, for the most part, that 1 in 4 families suddenly didn't have a source of income. So that was a really big deal. It was really negative impact for a lot of people, and we truly didn't have as many government programs and safety nets to help people as we do here in present day America. So this brings us to the next period of our macro history, the Age of Keynes. So in 1936, a famous economist, well, he's famous now, his name is John Maynard Keynes, published this book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. I mean, he really came up with a catchy title, huh? But what he said in this book was very different from the current economic mainstream thought processes back in the early 30s, okay? We were coming off, remember Adam Smith, that kind of grandfather of classical economic thought that said we should have free markets. We should have very little government intervention in our markets. So that's the way people were thinking, right? That we didn't need this government big brother to kind of interfere in our government. But then the travesty of the Great Depression happened. And people were hurting, right? 1 in 4 families didn't have a source of income. People were hurting. So people started to listen to Keynes and what he thought about our government and the government's role in our economy. So his basic argument was that aggregate demand is inherently unstable. He talked about these wild animal spirits of the firms. I'm not going to get into that too much, but basically that firms are very forward-looking. And if they panic, then they shut down, right? They might reduce production. They lay people off, which then puts our economy in this downward spin or downward cycle. So it's almost like the firms panic and their subsequent actions caused the very thing they were worried about. Okay, so aggregate demand's inherently unstable. If people don't have jobs, remember when we're talking about aggregate demand, we're talking about the demand of households, so consumption spending. We're talking about investment spending by firms, talking about government purchases, and then net exports. Again, I covered these briefly in the first part of the Chapter 5 lecture. So firms have panicked. They've decided not to spend money. 1 in 4 households no longer have a source of income. They can't spend money. Thanks to trade restrictions, world trade is pretty much choked out completely. That only leaves one group that contributes to total aggregate demand, the government. So here's what Keynes said. Okay, aggregate demand's inherently unstable. When we see this leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, government, it is your responsibility to help increase aggregate demand, to shift us back. So here we are, AD 33. Here was AD of 29. Here's my supply curve. So what it's saying is government, your job is to shift aggregate demand back out to the right to increase aggregate demand. How are they going to do this? Well, one way we call expansionary fiscal policy. We'll talk more about fiscal policy in the next unit. But the basic gist is that they can do 2 things. One, they can increase their own spending, their own demand for goods and services. And then 2, they can cut taxes, both taxes to the households and taxes to firms. And then that will help stimulate aggregate demand. If households have more money, they have more money to spend, okay? And that's a lot of the thinking. You know, we saw this in the Great Recession. President Bush did it first. He did a one-time tax rebate, like the summer of 2008, I believe it was. But we've also seen that here recently during the pandemic, right? We've had these, what do they call them? Stimulus checks. Well, the idea is that you give the households this money, they'll go out in our economy, buy goods and services, and get us kind of moving back in the right direction again. The problem, though, is that these are going to create what we call a federal budget deficit, okay? A federal budget deficit. And so a deficit is when our expenses or our expenditures exceed our revenues. And look what we've just said. Expansionary fiscal policy, increase government spending. So we're going to increase expenditures, cut taxes. Well, taxes is the primary form of revenue for our government. So we're going to increase spending while at the same time decreasing our revenue source. That is going to create federal budget deficits. And that's something that we hear all the time, present day in the US, deficit spending, our national debt is getting out of control. But really, prior to the Great Depression, this was not a very common thing. So we also call this type of economics demand-side economics because it's a macro policy focusing on shifting that aggregate demand curve back out to the right. The goal here is to promote full employment and price stability. And again, it's going to result in federal budget deficits, okay, having government spending exceed government revenues. But Keynes's idea was that if we increase aggregate demand, step one, this will increase real GDP or production, which in turn, if we want to produce more, we have to hire more laborers. So this increases employment. And it worked really well for several decades in the US. All the way up through the 1960s, we call it the golden age of Keynesian economics. We saw relatively low unemployment rates here in the US, very healthy growth, modest inflation. Everything was great. And then we got into the 1970s. So we had a recession, early 1970s, and we saw really high inflation as a result of this recession, and really high, and it's relative on a worldwide scale. The US, though, we typically average less than 2% of inflation every year. The recession was caused by two primary factors. Worldwide, we saw a lot of crop failures that year, which really hurt our agricultural markets. But then the second and probably more important factor was the OPEC embargo. So hopefully you guys know what OPEC is. It's basically an oil cartel. So it was a composition of several countries that had a large supply of oil. More of a micro topic, but a cartel. They often engage in what we call collusion, where they work together. So let me write that word down so y'all can see it, collusion. So those countries would work together to decrease supply because when they do that, it increases the price of oil, okay? And so we saw this was kind of the first time this group had used that power. And we had gas shortages here in the US. People were lining up around the block trying to get gasoline, and it was very expensive compared to what it had been previously. And so these factors contributed to the recession in the 1970s. So from 73 to 1980, we experienced something that was very different from what we had experienced during the Great Depression. This time, the problem was not with aggregate demand. So we actually saw a decrease in aggregate supply. And what this caused, here's a new term for you, we call it stagflation. So stagflation is a combination of a decrease in output with an increase in prices, which we call inflation. So you put those two words together, stagnation and inflation, and you get stagflation. So we saw our real GDP decrease. Unemployment went up to almost 9%, and we had our price level increasing about 20%, which again was very high for us here in the US. So looking at our macro aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, this is what we experienced over a 2-year period from 1973 to 1975. Again, so this time we had a leftward shift, but this time it was our aggregate supply curve. Again, though, this did cause a reduction in output, but now it's combined with increased prices. And again, if you use the percent change formula, and I have a separate video for that, but where you take your new index, subtract out the previous index, divide by the previous, and multiply times 100. If you did that here, so your new is 31.4, previously it was 26.3, we divide by 26.3, multiply times 100, then you should see inflation of about 20% if you calculate that math out. So this was a big problem. The bigger problem, if we take Keynes's look on it, there's a problem with the economy. Government, you should increase demand. Watch what happens. If the government tries to increase aggregate demand, shifting aggregate demand over to what I'm going to call AD2, here would be my new equilibrium up here. Well, what just happened? Well, by stimulating aggregate demand, we just caused more inflation, which is not a healthy thing for our economy. It's not something that we want to see. So suddenly in the 1970s, Keynesian economics was not the way to fix our macroeconomy. Instead, we needed some policies that would focus on flipping aggregate supply around and shifting it back to the right. How did they do that? Well, again, it's the supply side of the economy. So they focused on things like tax cuts for companies. So tax cuts was one of the ways. And then just other policies that were very like business-friendly policies. So whether it was, grants to firms or just some things that would help firms reduce their cost of production. So after that, we saw what we call relatively normal times. So we had employment growing, output was growing. We were, though, spending a lot of money. And so we did see our federal budget deficits increase again. We then had our longest expansionary period from 1991 to 2001. So we had 10 years of unprecedented economic growth, really thanks to new technology. The internet really transformed how our economy was able to function. We did have a brief recession in 2001. It lasted about 8 months. So we did some tax cuts. We increased some spending, which then increased the federal budget deficit. And then, again, we were fine for a while until the December of 2007 when the Great Recession began. So how did it start? The Great Recession began with us seeing declines in home prices and rising foreclosure rates. So people weren't able to pay their mortgages. I'm not going to get too much into this because we will spend part of chapter 13, I believe, has an entire unit on the Great Recession and kind of what caused the Great Recession. So we'll get more into that later in this course. At the beginning, we thought it was bad because, we were losing about 150,000 jobs a month, which seemed really bad. But after that, we actually averaged over 500,000 jobs lost every month for the span of the Great Recession. Overall, from December of 2007 through the summer of 2009, we saw total employment in the United States fall by 8.4 million jobs, which was a 6% reduction. Our output dropped 2%. We didn't really see a change in our price level. Finally, by the third quarter of 2009, our real GDP was growing again, but our unemployment rate was still really high. We were around 10% national unemployment. And again, we'll look more at all of those numbers for the recession in later chapters. So all in all, though, from 1929, so right at the start of the Great Depression until 2009, we did see a long-term growth in output. So we went from real GDP of about 1.1 trillion to 16.1 trillion, which is an annual growth rate of about 3.3%. Our average inflation rate was about 2.9%. A lot of that, though, the reason we're at almost 3 was due to the 1970s. If we took that decade out, we would be under 2%. We also saw tremendous population increase, employment increase. Again, for employment, you're going from households where typically only one adult worked to households where 2 adults work outside of the house. And overall, we've seen a huge increase in our standard of living, right? Higher levels of education attainment, higher quality of human capital, more physical capital, and overall, better technology have led to higher productivity. So, term that I do want you guys to know before I wrap up this chapter is real GDP per capita. Remember, real GDP is our measure of output. The phrase per capita means per person. So you take the total amount of goods and services produced in our economy, you divide it by our population, and that's your real GDP per capita, and it is the best measure of an economy's standard of living. That's all I have for Chapter 5. You guys let me know if you have any questions.